Why are we pushing the reading age earlier and earlier? Why are we pushing for longer hours and more homework? Why are we pushing for more tutoring? People don't actually realize that this is because we've crossed this tipping point where we made the mistake of too many school hours, not enough hobbies, and now we start to see kids really struggle.
Hi, I'm Carla. You're listening to Free to Be Curious. I've named this podcast after the values of freedom and curiosity. These inform and motivate the self-directed lifestyle choices that my family and I enjoy. I hope my guests inspire you as much as they inspire me. My guest today is Jana Clements. Jana is a leading self-directed education advocate. She has an honours degree in psychology, and when she decided to study further in the field of alternative education, Jana created her own training program for herself and other self-directed education facilitators as she discovered that there was no university syllabus to cater for this purpose. Jana has 16 years of experience in this field, including co-founding Riverstone Village, a democratic, self-directed education community in Johannesburg, South Africa, and also co-founding FREE, which stands for Full Human Rights Education Experience. Jana has written numerous books, including Help, My Kid Hates School, and What If School Creates Dyslexia. As well as the written resources I've just mentioned, Jana also offers courses to support parents and facilitators on alternative education campuses, appropriately titled Helping the Butterfly Hatch. Jana, I heard you talk recently on a Zoom presentation, and the topic was challenging ideas about dyslexia. What struck me the most was how strongly you came out in support of self-directed education. And you mentioned your experience and seeing self-directed students learn to read and write. My family is following a self-directed approach to education, so that conversation really resonated with me and it was reassuring. First of all, welcome to the Free to Be Curious podcast.
And thanks for having me here.
I thought we could start with just the basics. I'm assuming this idea is totally new or totally foreign for some of our listeners. Others may be totally terrified by the idea, and some families may be practicing it already. So can we start with what the basics are of self-directed education?
So it's a very simple concept in that we all learn through self-directed education, every single one of us, from when we are born until when we die. So if you look at a child who's learning to speak, they are learning through self-directed education. They have access to other people who can talk. They have interactions with those people who are talking with them. They have an inbuilt drive to master that communication so that they can connect and so that they can be capable and competent. So self-directed education is what happens when we start playing and exploring. We start being driven by our drives of curiosity and play and sociability, planfulness, the need for mastery, and the autonomy drive that says, I want to do it. I want to be able to do it. I want to do it myself. So very quickly, children learn to speak. They learn to walk. They learn to do all sorts of things that they don't go to lessons for, like riding a bicycle, watching mom joining in with the things that she's doing. They might learn all sorts of things like how to mop a floor, how to chop vegetables. The difference comes in our traditions around the stuff that we think of as school. And this is simply because historically, mom couldn't necessarily read. So if there was only one person in town who could read, and there was only one place in town where the books were, the kids had to go there. And the adults also had to go there to learn how to read and write. And if your parents didn't know very much about maths and they could basically, do their simple figuring, and there was somebody in town who knew what algebra was, you had to go to that person. You had to go to the place where those books were. So that's really how schools started. But throughout history, most people didn't learn through sitting at a desk and reading in a book. They learned practically. So if you wanted to learn how to be a blacksmith, you went and you apprenticed to a blacksmith. If you wanted to be the doctor, you went and you hung out with the doctor and helped the doctor as an assistant and picked up all the knowledge through conversation. And that's really how we are hardwired to learn. So this new idea, and it really is a new idea, of getting everyone to sit down in a desk and learn in theory from a book isn't really how we are wired to learn. Some subjects, it makes a lot of sense. Most subjects, it doesn't really, especially now that things have changed historically. So it's no longer true that you can't access text and learn how to read without going to the one place where the reading is happening, because you cannot avoid text anymore. In self-directed education, a lot of kids start learning to read just driving around, looking at billboards, noticing that there are number plates. Quite often, the first thing kids learn to read in South Africa is the security signs that they see on every wall, ADT or CSS. There's text on phones. Hopefully, your parent is reading to you from books, because this is also usually when children acquire literacy very quickly and very easily, it's in the families where they get a lot of role modeling and a lot of enjoyment out of the fact that, you know, the adult can take this amazing story out of this flat thing with these marks on it. And that's immediately fascinating. So playing with the tools of the culture is the way that we learn in self-directed education. And when we don't interrupt those drives, they keep operating as strongly as ever. When school comes into the mix, we actively interrupt those drives in every single way. We say, don't follow your curiosity because it's going to distract you from what I am trying to teach you. Don't get into your autonomy mode of I want to do it my way because I need you to do it my way. Don't make your own plans because I've already got a plan called a curriculum for you. Your drive for mastery is okay as long as you apply it to my interests, not to your interests. Learn to put your interests aside and focus on my interests. And we also interrupt the growing sense of competence by saying, no, you're doing it wrong. This is how you should do it, which starts eroding the child's trust in themselves and their own direction. When they're allowed to experiment and play and make mistakes, their drive for mastery keeps them on track so that they make their mistakes and they learn from them and they keep improving. People wonder, like, how do kids learn to read without lessons? You don't learn to read without support. Well, some kids do learn to read without support, but almost always there's going to be somebody that they can ask. What does this say? How does that sound? And they construct that knowledge for themselves. So Daniel Greenberg, the founder of Sudbury Valley School, which was open for 52 years before he passed away recently, but now it's still going strong. He called it a MODOR, a model of reality that the child builds from birth. You're building your own model of reality. And because you're constructing it yourself with your own brain, your own talents, your own worldview, your own perspectives, it's very, very strong because it's completely personalized. The moment that we bring a curriculum into the picture and lessons into the picture, then we're trying to import somebody else's MODOR. We're trying to do it your way instead of my way. Now, kids are very bright and very adaptable, and a lot of them manage to do that to a great extent, which is where a lot of kids will pass at school. Ironically, some of the most creative, brightest kids will struggle because their own MODOR is so powerful that they instinctively know it's not the best thing for them to import somebody else's inferior MODOR. And that's where we start labeling those kids as learning disabled, ironically, when they are super learning empowered. And for me, that's a great tragedy.
Wow, that was such an amazing introduction because I feel like you've covered a lot of stuff that's been on my radar, but I haven't fully put together and understood. You mentioned autonomous motivation. I want to go back to that. And then you also mentioned Daniel Greenberg. I'm reading his book at the moment, his collection of essays on how Sudbury actually worked. And I haven't really come across that term yet, but it makes so much sense. And generally in the world, everything is moving towards personalized, like personalized medicine for if you've got a condition, not some broad-based thing. So it makes sense that education should move to that space. Can we just rewind a little bit to the reading and maybe what I think is like a random thing that your kid can play until the end of play school or the end of kindergarten, and then they must go sit and work. So how would you say we define ages and stages for children, and the amount of playing and the amount of sitting and the amount of reading? How does a parent sort of navigate that space? Okay, now my child is 6. They must start learning how to read and write. Or now my child is 9. They must stop playing all day. Or they're little, so they should be playing all day and not doing any reading. How does one navigate ages and stages as a parent or a facilitator?
I think the first thing to be aware of is that the normal ages and stages that we see are just traditions, habits, cultural decisions that are made. So, everybody's making a big noise about Finland, who, lets the kids play until about 7 before getting going. And then they have these really great superior academic outcomes because they let the kids play longer. That seems to be the rule of thumb. Each perspective has its own little thing that it says. So, Montessori will say, oh, no, they should definitely be reading by like 4. And then Waldorf says, oh, no, you shouldn't want to get them reading until like 9. And then sort of the mainstream that says, 6, 5, preparing for 6. And that keeps pulling younger. So let's notice that when you said they're allowed to play in play school, that's not true anymore. We are more and more seeing 3-year-olds being told to sit and do a worksheet. And this is a tragedy because it actually prevents the kids from creating the foundations that they need in order to learn to read and write and do maths. Most people aren't aware of what those foundations are. For example, if you don't have enough shoulder strength, you will not have enough fine muscle control in your fingers. You are not going to manage to write nicely, and now you've got dysgraphia because you never climbed enough. What does a kid want to do? They want to climb on everything all the time. No, come and sit down, do your worksheet. We need to get you reading. Maths. Why do so many people struggle with maths? The foundations for maths are laid down through movement and rhythm. Skipping, jumping, hopping, playing with loose parts. Like I'm making myself a collection of acorns here in the dust, or I'm like building a Lego thing like 20 blocks high. These are your foundations that give you the concept of quantity and how you play with space and relationship in space. So music, rhymes. Most people don't realize that music is maths. That's why, that's a genetic inheritance. Most people who are skilled in or talented, let's say rather, in music will be talented in maths. So all of these foundations that you get through play and natural expression are shut down when we too quickly take that individual and we say, no, stop doing all that stuff. Now focus on your worksheets. The worksheets are very, very abstract. I find this quite sadly funny, that you can often take a kid who's been trained in procedural maths like you get at school, and they can recite their times table, and you can say to them, what's 5 7s? And they'll go 35. And you say to them, what's the difference between 5 7s and 7 5s? And then they'll look at you, but it's 35. It's 35 either way. It's 35. But what's the real difference? What's the difference in real life? What do you mean real life? They haven't actually connected it up. So you say, okay, so I'm going to get 7 people to hold up 5 fingers. Now I'm going to get 5 people to hold up 7 fingers. Is there any difference? Yes, there's a huge difference. The one you need 7 people for, the other you need 5 people for. So the kids who played have a natural intuitive understanding of this. And this is where it's really, really interesting to look at studies from the brief time when schools were allowed to innovate a lot more. Peter Gray writes about the primary schools in the early 1920s, where they stopped teaching formal maths until the age of 11 as an experiment. They were allowed to then. And then they contrasted those kids with the kids in the schools who'd been doing the procedural maths all the way. And the kids who only started later were behind for 6 months. And after 6 months, they screeched ahead because they weren't confused by that early conceptual learning. They'd actually created real foundations before they had to struggle with, why are we drawing these two lines on a page this way and it means this and that way? The brains were not mature enough usually. Very few kids' brains are mature enough to deal with really abstract symbols at the age of 6 or 7, and you're trying to get them to do long division. Then they get a lifelong math allergy because they think they can't do it because it's being introduced too early. So when we come to this question of ages and stages, the other problem we have is that each person matures at a vastly different rate. So again, if you had one room in town where there was one person who could teach this thing, they would need to cluster people together to learn as a group, because you just can't spend that much time individually tutoring each one. So you try and make a guess based on some kind of thumbsuck average. Okay, I'm going to try teach all the 6-year-olds to read, or I'm going to try teach all the 9-year-olds to read. Or you could just say, I'm going to teach anybody who's interested to read. And that's where we see schools like Summerhill School that's been open for 101 years now. They have regular curriculum, regular classes, British curriculum, just it's optional to come. And almost all the kids don't until they get into their teens, because they're busy creating their foundations through play and following their hobbies and interests. So you can take a child who is 4 into a system where you start to learn to read at 9, and that child's going to be very frustrated because nobody's going to be supporting them when they ask their questions, because they're ready to read now. What does this say? No, wait until you're 9. You can take a child who is 9, who is not yet ready to read, and this is where we often see the dyslexic profile, because a lot of dyslexic kids are not ready to read even at 9. They might be ready at 11 or 12, extreme outliers, maybe at 15. And then you take that kid and you say to them at 6, no, you must read now. And if you can't read now, there's something wrong with you. Now we're going to label you. Now we're going to take you against your will to remedial. And no matter how nicely you do it and how kindly you do it, you are telling that kid, don't trust yourself. There's some fundamental way that you are flawed. And you start impacting their sense of competence, so that by the time their brain is finally ready, whether it was at 9 or 10 or 15, their brain's finally ready, they've already got this ingrained sense, I can't do this reading thing. I'm useless at this reading thing. And we see this in kids who've come out of regular school into self-directed education. Sometimes it can be really difficult for them to heal because it's so ingrained. I can't do maths. I hate maths, because they've got trauma around this now. So Peter Gray, when he was studying the alumni of the Sudbury Valley School, he came across 2 15-year-olds, completely separate years, didn't know each other, who had come in diagnosed with dyslexia, completely unable to read, and when they arrived at Sudbury Valley in their teens, in their mid-teens. And both of them were reading within a few months of arriving at Sudbury Valley School. So he followed up and he went back and he asked them, what? How come? How did you suddenly become able to read? And they had very, very similar answers along the lines of, well, there wasn't any pressure anymore. Nobody expected me to. I could kind of quietly do it with nobody watching. So now I taught myself, because they could avoid the shame and the pain of somebody like watching them to see if they were going to manage it and helping them because they can't. They could kind of secretly teach themselves to read. And so they did, because their brains were finally ready and they managed to heal enough that they were confident enough to give it a go. So ages and stages, ask any mom who's got a couple of kids. Your kids are totally different. Each one is totally different. Genetic heritage, whatever, even when they're chips off the old block, this one will be on a completely different schedule and interest to that one. So it's really best to follow the child.
I was just going to ask you, so given all that, how do we do it? How does a person follow the child? What does it look like? So I've got a kid, and what do I do? What do I do now if I want to do self-directed education?
So that's not a thing that we're going to answer in the space of one podcast. So if you're going to do self-directed education, what you want to do is you want to educate yourself first. Whatever your learning style is, there's so many resources now. I mean, you mentioned reading Daniel Greenberg's book. He wrote multiple books, right? You can also get those in the form of audio. There's now numbers of movies, videos, podcasts, and then live learning by apprenticeship. Go meet some unschooling families. Go start getting yourself a community, because the other thing is that until you hook into the unschooling community or the self-directed education community, it can feel like it's very, very small, and you're going to be the only one, and everyone's going to think you're crazy. Whereas it's actually a big and growing community. And once you jump into it, you'll actually find it's big enough that you'll be able to find other people that you relate to from your particular religion, worldview, language group, whatever. You will find those people that you can relate to and feel comfortable with. And your kids will find friends that they can share interests with. It's growing every day. Then once you're doing that, we say that you go through a period of deschooling. So for the adult, this is letting go of these beliefs that you've learned about what education is, what school is, what the point of it is, how it works. Because I also went to school. It took me a while to let go of, but surely it can't be that natural. But you go through that process, and part of that process is starting to watch and see the change in your kids. Either the change between when they were at school and now, or the difference between them and maybe their cousins who are still in school. And that takes time to see that kind of difference. And that difference only comes when we allow them to also deschool. So deschooling for a child is basically about healing, about returning to that wisdom that's built into them.
And getting back their autonomous motivation that
exactly
is driving the whole thing. Like you mentioned in the beginning, we're wired that way. The autonomous motivation is hardwired into us. So that makes sense. So if I can read between the lines, it's like trust the kids. Don't worry too much about them. Focus on yourself and giving yourself the support and resources and education that you need to support your kid. And if it means that they're playing all day, even when they're 6, that's okay at any age, because we're trusting them.
It's more than okay.
More than okay.
It's more than okay. So this is the big, big, big aha. Recently, I was struggling to edit something on video because I don't really video edit much, but I've tried. I've spent quite a lot of hours, and I can do the basics. And I had to go and ask my son a few questions, right? Let's notice that. Okay, I had to go and ask my son a few questions. Why does he know so? He hasn't done a video editing course ever. He's only played with it. And he literally said to me, because he's been self-directing all his life, basically, because I discovered about this when he was tiny. And he said to me, your problem, adults, you're in this mindset where you have to learn the thing, or you have to be serious about it. You have to get your outcome. That's why you don't know enough. It's like if you've just played with it, you'd learn everything you need to know. So we've got this very weird concept that I think comes in from, that time in school's heyday, when school was essentially to train factory workers, to get people to stop pursuing the love of life and the joy of life and be content with sitting doing something mind-numbing all day for hardly any pay. That radical obedience training that school was then shaped for, that still stays with us today, that was necessary because they had to have factory workers who were happy to put a nut on a bolt, a nut on a bolt, a nut on a bolt, a nut on a bolt. So write out your lines, repeat your times table, repeat your times table. It's actually just training for mediocrity. And we've now retained this as an idea of education. Through that time, it was very, very important to instill this idea that pleasure is bad, that obedience is virtue, and that sticking with the boring task is somehow morally superior and good for your soul. And this message was necessary because otherwise, who's going to do it? But it hangs over in the culture because we pass on the message that we learned. So we got this artificial distinction. It's like work is good and will get you places. Play is bad and will waste your time. And it's actually the opposite of the truth. If you look throughout the natural world, every single creature learns through play. And we absolutely learn through play. Ask anybody what a hobby is. What is a hobby? What's a hobby? A hobby is a thing that you probably know more about than anything else in the world because you play with it and nobody is taking away your autonomous motivation and turning it into controlled motivation by rewarding you or punishing you for your hobby because you're completely free. And my fear for this generation of kids is this. Our generation had lots of hobbies and people didn't realize that the real education was happening through our free time in spite of our school hours. Why are we pushing the reading age earlier and earlier? Why are we pushing for longer hours and more homework? Why are we pushing for more tutoring? People don't actually realize that this is because we've crossed this tipping point where we made the mistake of too many school hours, not enough hobbies. And now we start to see kids really struggle because, again, the foundations are not there. The learning experiences are not there. They've only got this fake, weak little substitute of like worksheets and textbooks and tests. And so they're struggling more and more. And we do that crazy thing of going, oh, yeah, let's have more of a bad thing because it's going to help. We couldn't do anything worse. So the critical thing is that for your kids to play all day fruitfully in a way that really leads to a rich education, they need a rich environment. And that might not be what you think it is.
What is a rich environment?
So Peter Gray's research has been very, very valuable. And he mapped out a list of optimizing conditions. And this is also why I do what I do, because I've seen a lot of people kind of go into self-directed education, maybe with a little bit too much of an either or. Yeah, it's like either we're going to like follow a curriculum, make sure they're doing their maths and English, and then give them a little bit of free time, or like, oh, whatever, they'll be fine. Never mind. So there are optimizing conditions for self-directed education. It's beyond the scope of this call to go into them in a lot of detail. Again, this is a big topic, but you can get the list. You can get the list. You can look at the list and you can say, how much am I managing this one? What could I do more on that one? What could I do on the other? So, for example, just to briefly dip in and out of that list, playing with the tools of the culture. Are there things that my child's interested in that they don't have access to? How could I get them an opportunity to play with that thing? Does somebody else have it that we could go visit? Is it there in the public space somewhere that we could go and access it? Can we hire it? Can we take them on an experience? Kids will be confined by what they can access. Our kids at Riverstone, I don't think there's a teenage boy who doesn't know how to build a computer. They're generally advising their parents on what components you need and what went wrong because they've just been allowed to play with it. But if they didn't have a computer box that they could take apart and experiment with and upgrade, they wouldn't get that experience because they don't have access to that tool of the culture. Sewing machine. You're not going to learn how to sew a straight seam on a sewing machine if you don't have access to one. Kitchen. You're not going to learn to cook from a textbook. At least the conventional education has sort of realized that. And okay, we have to put them in front of an actual stove at some point. They can't just write a test on like how many minutes to boil an egg. But that applies to everything. Conflict resolution is a tool of the culture. How are you going to learn that if your parents are always jumping in and solving it for you or punishing you or telling you what and telling you who and judging and punishing and dividing up? How are you going to learn to resolve stuff if you don't get to play with that? We want to keep the kids safe enough, but we often make stupid, random decisions about what safety is. We try and prevent a grazed knee. Why do you want to prevent a grazed knee? That's a learning experience. Sure, prevent a trip to the emergency ward, yes, please, but not a grazed knee. Just dipping into another optimizing condition, free mixing with age-mixed peers. It's really important for kids to have access to people of different ages. You see incredible interactions going on between tiny tots and bigger ones. There's so many natural dynamics. Again, if we go back to how we've always done it, we lived in little villages. The kids were running around everywhere, getting into everybody's business, chatting to this person, chatting to that person, playing in age-mixed groups. And so much mentoring and inspiration and consolidation of the older person's knowledge, or just the more experienced person's knowledge, sometimes not necessarily older, when they pass it along. All of this is very, very powerful in self-directed education. But as a parent, the most important ones will actually be the ones to do with your role. So, for example, the first optimizing condition is the reality, the social expectation and reality that the child has responsibility for their own education. And that's the foundational one that most people struggle with, because it means really letting go and really trusting the child. It means not hovering, not saying, ooh, I'm going to give this a try. But if they don't learn to read within 6 months, then I'm calling in a tutor, because the child then gets this message that this isn't for real. I actually need to try and figure out what it is that you want me to do. What are the conditions on my freedom? If I manage this, you're going to let me carry on doing stuff. If I don't manage that, I won't. So I'm trying to figure out what you want so that I know what to want, what I should want to want. What should I want to want? That is not self-direction. Self-direction is very deep within you. Whatever your worldview is, it's like the creator, Mother Nature, whatever, doesn't make mistakes. It's like an oak tree is an oak tree, and it's not going to grow into a pine tree. A snail is a snail, and it's not going to grow into a beaver. And a particular human with these talents is that person, and those talents are going to optimize in the right space. They're not going to become that thing that you thought you wanted to be, and you're so disappointed you weren't, that you want your child to be. They are not you. So all those things that you found so valuable for yourself that you want to pass on to your child, well, I'm sorry, but they're not you. So that first optimizing condition is really, really important.
To trust that our kids can do this thing. They actually can educate themselves, and it's a matter of trusting. And I think it goes back to what you said, which is that the parents need to find their own support system. And you mentioned Riverstone Village. I think that it sounds absolutely incredible. When I was looking on the website, I saw one quote on the description that basically reminded me of like an opportunity cost. It said something like, when you're being imposed upon with somebody else's curriculum, you're losing out on becoming your unique person. I'm sort of paraphrasing what I read. And that opportunity cost is just, from what I understand now, it's too expensive. I can't unknow this information, to know that the opportunity cost of forcing some beliefs and curriculum and even my wishes for my kid upon them is too expensive on their developing their unique self. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about founding Riverstone and what it's like for children to come to a Riverstone and experience self-directed education in that setting. I know we don't have that much time, maybe just like a brief understanding of what Riverstone is.
So I'm going to give you the long-ish answer anyway, because
Sure.
My father recently passed away. But we're really feeling his legacy and noticing his legacy as a result now. What did he leave behind? He was a co-founder of Riverstone Village. And he was a co-founder of Riverstone Village because this is the opportunity cost thing that I want to talk about. Because he firstly was a teacher for many years, primary school, high school, and then became a psychologist. He went and studied psychology of education in London. And then he went to Wits University to become the head of the counseling and careers unit. So he was not lecturing in this subject or that subject kind of on the inside. He was watching how these students coped. He was in the career psychology side. He was looking at the kids dropping out, the kids failing, the kids just getting pregnant or drunk, the kids who were passing but miserable, the people who got their degrees cum laude and then discovered that they didn't like this thing after all and went off, instead of doing the medicine they studied, went off to teach yoga. He saw all of that from a really overview perspective. And that idea of the opportunity cost, that the kids are studying these academic curricula in order to get these entrance requirements for university at the opportunity cost of coming to know themselves, actually. And he started recommending gap years to everybody. He said, please don't come straight to varsity. Please give them a gap year. So they've got a hope in heck of choosing the right thing when they come to varsity. And then his thinking kept evolving. And he was like, well, why a gap year? Why not like 12 years of getting to know yourself? The universities around Sudbury Valley School in the US, just take them. They're like, oh, you came from Sudbury Valley. Yes, please. Because you're not this 18-year-old who doesn't know what, but the next step is varsity. And, mommy said like psychology is a good idea, or like daddy said engineering is a good idea, or accounting or whatever. It's like they're not that kind of student. And this is actually the advice from the latest career counseling thought leaders. Don't go and get a random qualification, especially that you have to go into debt for. Go in the direction of your passion in your career until you hit a ceiling that you can't go further without a qualification. Now you know exactly which qualification and probably what the best facility is to do it through. Now you're not wasting your time and money. That's the time to do it. So the self-directed kids don't go to university unless they already know why, where, what they want to do. So the way that they started breaking through in other places, we're still very young here, but the way they started breaking through in other places was by actually contacting the key people and going, this is why I want to do your course. And this is what I have been doing that makes me know that I'm ready for your course. And that's very convincing, because then, you have students who are going to perform very well because they're highly motivated. I remember when I was a student and we were all astonished. There was one mature student in our class, an old lady who'd come back to study for fun. She was the only one who did the homework. The rest of us were still in avoid the learning, we hate school kind of mode. And that's just not what self-directed learners are like. So when a child comes to Riverstone Village, the best thing is for them to come at 4 or 5 before they've had any interruption, because then they just play all day. And as they get older, they start playing with more and more complicated stuff, which is where my son now plays with abstract physics. He loves trying to figure out stuff about the speed of light. It's fun for him. And then, kind of doing the math that goes with that is fascinating. He loves reading parts from William Shakespeare because it's fun. It's like challenging enough now because he's 17. He loves figuring out difficult coding bits that are really hard because he's just been playing all the way with more and more complicated stuff. Now, not every child is going to do that. And that's the thing. It's your child might never have fun playing with maths, but they might have a heck of a lot of fun playing with ceramics and become a master ceramicist. Is it really better for you to make sure that they go to university and get a degree in history in order to become a master ceramicist? If I think about our ceramics teacher at Riverstone Village who comes in, he studied paleontology. He's master ceramicist. It can be fun. It can be great to study these extra things if you have the time and money. The other kids who come to Riverstone Village later usually have to go through a healing process if they've been in school. So that's a deschooling process where they'll need some time to rediscover their self-direction. And one of the things that people find hardest is that there will always be a period of boredom, even for the fully self-directed kids. There'll be times when they're bored silly. And it's really important to not misinterpret that, because that's partly when you realize that nothing that's easily available to you is that appealing. And you go into a kind of an incubation stage. Now, this is also where I love the metaphor of the butterfly, because most people, most people, I've come across a lot of people, and I used to think that the butterfly in the cocoon is like a caterpillar that's busy growing its wings. And it's not. If you open a cocoon, as some of our kids have, you will find goo, because it actually melts down into soup. And then it grows a new body. It doesn't just sit there as a caterpillar and grow some wings. And we go through a kind of a similar sort of metaphoric process to that, in that there's times when it's like, I feel blah because I've kind of exhausted the possibilities of where my life is right now. Some adults make a lot of mistakes about this in their midlife crisis, right? And they go looking for something to fix it quickly. A new relationship, a car, a radical change or whatever. But it's often this blah bored stage that is like something new needs to happen, something new is going to emerge, but I'm in this interim space. Again, our culture doesn't allow for that. You've got to be busy, engaged, having fun, entertained all the time.
Not wasting a minute of time, achieving stuff every second.
So then we fill the kids' space with edutainment. Oh, we better sign them up for more stuff. With edutainment, more apps, whatever. We call that edutainment, and it's very distracting. Again, throughout our history, we had long walks in the field. We had to walk 20 miles to get somewhere. We had lots of time that was completely unstructured, where we were just kind of in an interim space. It's like noticing the birds and the trees. That kind of space is hugely important for that kind of deep stuff to emerge. And it's often at the end of a period of that boredom that you'll then see this leap, or this new interest ignite, or this new level of commitment to ignite, as the person goes, well, they're going to solve their own boredom problem their own way, in a much more exciting way than we can ever do when we apply them with entertainment.
That's very reassuring. I've often actually been a bit afraid if my son said he was bored. It's actually made me feel afraid that I've missed out on something, and it's important to have time to decompress, regenerate your reserves and let your brain rest and stuff. So it's a totally different view, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I want to very quickly just note that, because this is important.
Yes.
This is why the optimizing conditions are important, because there's a very big difference between boredom from being understimulated and under-resourced, and creative boredom. And the optimizing conditions will help us know the difference, because you can have a bored child, which is not good, because they don't have access to enough stuff and they can't do anything and they're not empowered, right? Whereas if you've got your optimizing conditions in place, they've got access to enough tools of the culture, they've got access to enough peers, they've got access to enough variety of adults, opportunities, they know how to ask the stuff and make it happen. Now I can absolutely trust boredom. Otherwise, you go to your optimizing conditions, and if you're feeling in doubt, just go to your optimizing conditions and say, and have a conversation with them. Are there any of these things that you think are like maybe needing a bit more in our setup?
Right. Have a conversation with your child. That's another foreign and crazy for another podcast. That's like hours and hours. But before we go, do you mind directing us to your resources? You've got your own website where people can book courses and webinars, and you offer support to people who are doing alternative education. So if you can direct us to where you are and the work that you're doing, so that people can contact you and pursue their own education for their kids.
My website's due for a year-end overhaul, but it's there at janaclements.com, and it will continue to be there. That's probably the best place. You can contact me direct by email on theshiftwillcome@gmail.com. The shift will come.
I hope so. I really do.
Yeah. And apart from that, please immerse yourself in everything. There's so much on selfdirected.org. That's the Alliance for Self-Directed Education's website, based in America, but it's got a bit of international reach. But there's lots and lots of articles written by people from all over the world. If you go into their Tipping Points magazine section, you'll really get such a rich overview. There's some resources there on Free, FHREE. I am working on putting together a circle community, hopefully for the new year. I actually started trying to get it done this year, and then my dad had his stroke, and it was just like, nah, not time. But hopefully we'll get that going next year. That I really think will be very exciting, because then that will also provide a space for you to network without the noise of social media. Please do go join the groups on Facebook, but they've become a bit quiet, because you don't get the notifications, and then there's so much noise, and then you're being distracted by like politics on the other side of the world and hurricanes on the other side of the world. So we really want more of these spaces where you can just directly network and interact. Would this
be an online space that you're talking about, the circle? An online space for people to have it's their own.
You need online
community
spaces in order to find out where your offline spaces are and can be put together. So right now, for example, because I also specialize in pathological demand avoidance, which is a particular autistic subtype. And right now I'm chatting to a couple of people in Cape Town who I've met separately, who've contacted me separately about this. And I'm going, but hang on a sec, you're in Cape Town, you're in Cape Town, you're in Cape Town, and you're all saying you need something. Let's 2023, let's get you guys together and experiment with how you can create something for your kids. So these online spaces are very, very necessary so that you can find your neighbors.
Yes, exactly.
Because the world's very noisy. And that's also why you should give your kids more computer time, because they need to learn how to navigate the space, and they won't get that if you give them an hour a day. Not under 3. Not under 3.
Okay.
But
that's a hard one
as
for
they
me,
get older.
I have to say. Let them, trust them. Again, I've trusted my kid to learn how to feed and eat, and but why is there some resistance to trust him with the computer and the computer time? It's something to overcome. There's some resistance there. I'm going to say something
radical to you that a lot of people will find hard to understand, or hard to cope with.
Yes.
But this is really important.
Yes.
The only way that a self-directed kid is going to be able to have a girlfriend in Singapore and a game design collaborator in Russia is if they're allowed to be awake at 2 a.m. on their computer. And I'm just talking about somebody I know and whose life is very, very rich because of those two things. Right.
It is. It's a tough one, but I understand what you're saying, and I'm gonna sit with that for a bit. I know our time is nearly up. I just wanted to mention the Peter Gray. You mentioned Peter Gray. There's another book, something I remember reading about the hidden agenda of the compulsory curriculum dumbing us down. There's that book.
That's John Taylor Gatto.
That's the guy I was thinking of. And Peter Gray. Are those good starting points? And then the self-directed education.org.
Naomi Fisher in the UK is recently writing really great resources. There's so many now. People don't realize how huge this is.
So that's what I'm feeling is nice. There is so much. And your books, they're available on Amazon. Is that right?
That's
you can get them online. Okay.
English, so and then the dyslexia book's also been translated into French now. It's been published in France. And there's a German publishing thing busy translating it at the moment as well into German. Yeah.
That's excellent, Jana. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that we get to chat again, and maybe I'll come to Riverstone with my 5-year-old and my 1-year-old. Thanks very much for your time. That was really informative and very interesting and uncomfortable at parts, which I guess that's the journey.
That's real learning. Is always going to
embrace
have discomfort.
It's not going to be comfortable, and our kids are not always going to be comfortable, so it makes sense. Anyway, so thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And I'll be in touch.
Lovely, Carla. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for spending this time with me. I love getting to know my listeners, so please do subscribe to my podcast on your chosen podcast app. Engage with me in meaningful conversation on my comment-friendly blog, and send me an email to share your self-directed life story. My website address is free2BCurious.com, and my email address is carla@free2BCurious.com. I really look forward to getting to know you.